A lot of time spent this week, Senator, on charter school legislation.
That's exactly right. Charter bill was on the floor for several hours, had a number of senators that were standing in opposition to it, and a lot of things were thrown around. I'm not sure that there was a lot of discretion in some of the numbers that were thrown around. I'm not sure they were completely, transparent numbers, or maybe I should say completely reflective. Missouri's charter schools were indicted kind of on the floor. The bill would have expanded some of the access to charter schools to more parents, more communities, and even more traditional public schools. You know, a traditional public school can they can sponsor their own charter, so they can have charter schools. I've long felt like that is really a great opportunity for some of our traditional public schools if they want to try out new approaches, new techniques, if they want to escape some of the burden of regulatory oversight that they are under now. We frequently hear from school superintendents that they're overburdened with a lot of the regulations and the things that they're forced to do, and I don't disagree with that. So far, I've been unsuccessful in getting any of them to give me a list of the ones that should be removed. But one of the ways they could demonstrate some of those mandates are unnecessary and non-productive would be to start their own charter school, allow some of their students to attend that charter. Those charter schools are exceptional in the way that they're governed, and so they could then set them up to be absent some of those mandates and demonstrate that those mandates are negatively influence education in the traditional school, and that could be very helpful in terms of education reform and new approaches. Kansas City is the only school that has actually started a charter, and I think theirs was a tailored charter to specific interests in education. I'm not sure that it was for the purpose of trying to figure out how escaping some of those oversight mandates would be beneficial, but I think it could be done that way. We just haven't seen that happen, even though that is available to our traditional charter schools. If we look at Missouri schools, we have something like over 24,000 that are enrolled in Missouri, and about half of those in Kansas City, about half of those in St. Louis. Overall have pretty good numbers. They are a very diverse group. It's something like 70% of those students who are African Americans and about 20% are white. They've got a significant Latino population of around 5%. The rest is just made up of maybe other nationalities. So they're a group that is serving that population and serving them, I think, pretty well. 60% of the top 10 schools in Missouri are in the Kansas City and St. Louis charter schools. Now, you didn't hear that on the floor when we debated the bill. You heard other numbers about the lack of success or the number of charters that were closing. There was a study that suggested that 1 in 4 charter schools fail. I read the report on that study. I wasn't completely convinced that it was not prejudiced in some way, but given our current success level in our traditional public schools, we have something less than 50% of our students that are reading at grade level or doing math at grade level. 75% sounds like a pretty good success rate to me. So it's like if we could get 75% success, we would take that. 90% of the top language arts schools, public schools in Kansas City are charter schools. A lot of people don't realize that. 90% of the top language arts schools in St. Louis are charter schools. These are numbers that weren't necessarily brought forward by the opponents of charter schools the other night on the floor. And 70% of the top math schools in Kansas City and St. Louis are charter schools. So the charter schools have had failures. Every school has successes and failures. We've seen, for example, one of our most successful school districts in the state is in Springfield. And Springfield is often used as an example of a successful school district, someone that's doing very well. But within that district are 5 schools that would be shut down if there were charter schools. They wouldn't still be operating. They are operating. There are students in those schools. Those students are not learning like we would like Missouri students to learn, but you would never know that because the district is what gets the ranking, not those individual buildings. That's not the way charter schools are evaluated. They're evaluated on a building by building. And so we do know that if one of those buildings is failing, we know it. We know that happens. And there are procedures to make sure that, first of all, that the school gets better, ideally, and if it doesn't, then that it's shut down, and that there's a way for those students to go back into either a different charter or back into the traditional public school. I would have voted for the charter expansion. I hope we get it back on the floor. I hope we can address some of the expressed concerns and can move that bill forward. I would like to see more of our parents across the state of Missouri have access to charter schools if they believe their children, their students would do better in a different school environment.
What is the difference between a charter school and a traditional public school?
They're both public schools. The difference for the charter is that the charter school is operated more like an independent entity. They have a separate board that directs them. They have a sponsor that basically is responsible. If there's a failure in that school, that sponsor is who you go to and who has to answer to the State Board of Education for why that school's not performing. They're the ones that have to address those needs and make sure that that happens. To me, the biggest difference is that in a charter, students are there because they want to be there. You've had to ask or apply or go through a lottery. In some way, you've had to ask to go to that school. That's not the case, of course, in the traditional public schools. You're assigned there according to your zip code, and that's the school that you're assigned to. Parents don't have any choice in that unless their choice is to go to a charter. And unless that charter is sufficient for all the parents that want their children in a different environment, a lot of those parents don't get that choice. As we've probably all seen pictures on the news when some of the charter schools in other areas of the country are having their lotteries, and parents are sitting there hoping their number gets called, and we see the tears stream down the faces when the numbers are all in and they didn't get chosen and they were so wanting their children to be in that charter school. I don't know that you see that kind of emotion on the traditional public schools because you're just assigned to them. Teachers are not tenured, so the charters are free to pick the best teachers, and if the teacher's not performing, they're free to dismiss that teacher and put someone else in that classroom. There are a lot of the other state mandates that charters are not subject to, and if you talk to superintendents of the traditional schools, they'll say, well, that's why the charters can sometimes outperform them, and they'll point that out, but I still haven't been able to get them to tell me which of those mandates they want us to remove. So it's a little bit of a disingenuous, I think, concern sometimes.
And charter schools, I think, are becoming, I think the concept is growing, not just in Missouri, but throughout the country as well.
It is. I mean, Missouri has been significant. We have something like, I think, 37% of the St. Louis schools that are charters, and almost 50% in Kansas City are charters. Nationwide, we're seeing, I think, an explosion of charters, but also of other approaches to education. One of the things that there are organizations that try to keep up with where is education headed across the country, and some of those numbers are interesting. One survey showed that if you consider all of the avenues to educate children, the avenue that is most satisfactory to parents is home education. That might be somewhat intuitive. I mean, if a parent wants to do that, then they're committed to it. We're seeing somewhere between 80 and 90% of parents who are very happy with home education once they've experienced home education. Private school is also very high. The private school satisfaction level, again, is in that 90% range. The parents have their kids in private school and are satisfied. If you go to public charter schools, it drops down some. It drops down into the 75% range of parental satisfaction. And then if you go to the traditional schools, it drops a little bit further down, maybe to 73% satisfaction. So the public charters and the public traditional have pretty close satisfaction levels from parents. Most satisfactory is the home education. Private schools is virtually the same as the home education. So those are some of the numbers that reflect that choice is important, that there are parents that really do like choice. It's a fairly small percentage. In most states, it's less than 10% of students that are choosing something other than the traditional school experience. But those 10%, and may have gotten over 10% in some states that have had choice for a while, the parental satisfaction goes way up once the parents can actually choose where their students go to school. If you just ask parents where they want their children to go to school, you'll see about 40% of school parents want their children in private school. About 36% say they want a traditional public school. So you see a little bit of a divergent there too in terms of, and I think that reflects again the parental choice. My opinion on how to improve education is to get parents more involved. One of the best ways to do that is give them choices. I've heard people say you can have parents who have virtually no interest in their child's K through 12 education experience, but will pore over college catalogs. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is that? My answer to that is because the parents have choices.